Chapter 7: The Shadow of the Church. The world was still reeling from the shocking assassination of Elias Moreau when another revelation sent waves of disbelief across the global consciousness. This time it began with an ominous cryptic message, a warning that appeared out of nowhere. The message was brief, yet its implications resonated deeply, igniting a storm of speculation and alarm. It was sent from an encrypted account, signed by an unknown entity with the handle prophet@eglise.org. The message, written in cold, dispassionate prose, held no name or face behind it, only a chilling command to heed the truth hidden in the deepest of places. Truth has no master. Lies serve the throne. Open your eyes, for even the shepherds have wolves among them. What you seek is buried deep within the house of God. Along with this haunting message was a batch of classified documents that began circulating on underground forums, encrypted chat rooms, and independent news sites. These files, carrying the stamp of Vatican approval and secrecy, exposed something darker, more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. They hinted at a level of corruption far beyond what had already been unveiled: the Catholic Church's involvement in the murder of Elias Moreau. Worse still, the documents connected not only the Vatican, but also the remnants of the French monarchy to this sinister plot. Within hours, the files had been downloaded and shared thousands of times, flooding independent news outlets faster than government censors could track. The world was waking up to a new reality. The documents came in various forms: confidential communications, memos marked strictly confidential, and highly sensitive internal reports. These documents, seemingly harmless at first glance, held damning secrets that could unravel the very fabric of both religion and politics. Independent journalists and amateur investigators scrambled to decode the intricacies of the documents, but what they uncovered was nothing short of a global conspiracy, one that linked the highest echelons of the Vatican to a covert Catholic sect, the Brotherhood of Saint Remy. The Brotherhood of Saint Remy was a shadowy organization, rumored to operate in the darkest corners of the Church's hierarchy. Their existence was long considered an urban myth, whispered about in conspiracy circles, but now, in the light of these documents, it seemed the rumors had been true. The Brotherhood operated for centuries, pulling strings from the shadows, maneuvering not just religious matters, but also political affairs. They were protectors of a doctrine so ancient, so powerful, that it had been passed down through generations of select individuals, members who believed they alone were destined to guard the true fate of humanity. In one particular document, a letter from an unnamed cardinal to his superiors, the words were carefully chosen but unmistakably clear: Moreau's knowledge is a threat to the doctrine. This ominous phrase indicated that the famed philosopher's work on Orpheus and his discoveries posed a significant danger to the very foundations of the Church's spiritual and political control. According to the document, the Orpheus project must not see the light of day. This was not just a political assassination, it was an ideological battle fought in the halls of the Vatican, and Moreau had become its martyr. Other leaked files were even more chilling. They revealed a direct line of communication between the cardinal and an individual referred to only as the Crown. The discussions were cryptic, but enough was disclosed to reveal the frightening reality of what was at stake: a quest to restore the old order. The crown in question was not just a symbol of monarchy, but a direct reference to a living descendant of the once reigning French royal family, possibly the last legitimate heir to the Bourbon throne. This information opened up an unsettling possibility. The French monarchy, long thought to be a relic of history, might not only still exist, but could be actively involved in the political machinations of the present. The documents were undeniably linked to the French aristocracy, their names, dates, and bloodlines connected to the powerful forces behind Moreau's assassination. Among the whispers in these papers was the urgent mention of restoring order to a world on the brink of sacrilege. This was no longer just about power, it was about controlling the narrative of history itself, ensuring that the royal bloodline could return to its rightful place, one that aligned with the doctrines of the Church. In the days that followed, as the documents spread like wildfire across the internet, the global reaction was immediate and intense. News outlets scrambled to verify the authenticity of the files, while government agencies and religious institutions quickly moved to dismiss the allegations. The Vatican, faced with the explosive nature of the leaks, issued an emergency statement denouncing the documents as fabrications aimed at undermining the moral integrity of the Church. Meanwhile, France's government, initially silent on the issue, began to feel the pressure. Protesters flooded the streets of Paris, demanding answers from both the Church and the French authorities. The implications were vast, and the public, already disillusioned by the political unrest that had rocked the country in recent months, was ready for answers. Conspiracy theorists quickly seized upon the leaks, theorizing about a grand alliance between the Vatican and the French monarchy to control the spiritual and temporal fate of the world. Some believed that Moreau's work on the Orpheus Project had uncovered an ancient truth so dangerous, so transformative, that the forces in power had no choice but to silence him. Others wondered if the documents indicated a more sinister plan, a war for control of humanity's very soul, a war that had been fought for centuries in the shadows. But as the public clamored for more information, the hunt for the source of the leaks began. The identity of the hacker known as Prophet was now at the forefront of global intelligence operations. Agencies from all corners of the world launched a massive cyber search, hoping to track down the person responsible for exposing these explosive files. Speculation ran rampant. Was Prophet an insider within the Vatican? A rogue whistleblower disillusioned with the Church's power? Or perhaps someone with a more personal stake in the Orpheus Project? A member of Moreau's inner circle, or even a former ally turned enemy? Meanwhile, inside a hidden safe house in a remote location, Celeste Durand and Professor Adrien Vasseur sat hunched over a table, poring over the leaked documents. The gravity of what they were reading weighed heavily on them. Moreau had always warned of powerful enemies lurking in the shadows, but neither Celeste nor Vasseur could have imagined a conspiracy of this magnitude, one that reached so deeply into the highest institutions of both church and state. The implications were vast, and the road ahead would be treacherous. If this is true, Vasseur muttered, his voice barely above a whisper, then we aren't just dealing with a few rogue assassins. We're dealing with a war that's been fought for centuries, a war for the very soul of history itself. Celeste looked at him, her face pale, her mind reeling. And we're caught right in the middle of it. Far away, in the heart of Rome, beneath the ancient hallowed halls of the Vatican, the high-ranking cardinals gathered in secret, their faces drawn and tired from the strain of recent events. One of the most senior cardinals, his hand trembling slightly as he placed a copy of the leaked documents on the table before him, glanced around the room. "Find the hacker," he whispered urgently. "We must silence them before they reveal what cannot be undone." The shadow of the Church was long and far-reaching, and its tendrils stretched across history. But in that moment, those very shadows seemed to tremble, as if the weight of centuries-old secrets was finally becoming too much to bear. The game had changed, and with it, the stakes had become far more perilous. The world stood on the brink of revelations that could shatter everything it believed to be true. And at the heart of it all stood a woman and a professor, two individuals, caught in the unraveling of a conspiracy that had been centuries in the making. They had no choice but to follow the trail, no matter where it led, because the truth was more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. The shadow of the Church was stretching out once more, and it was not done claiming souls. Chapter 8: The Catacombs Chase. The air was thick, suffocating, as the cold, oppressive atmosphere of the Paris catacombs enveloped them. A sense of dread lingered in every breath, filling the lungs with the heavy stench of damp earth and decaying bones, a reminder that they weren't just in any old tunnel, but in the tomb of the forgotten, a place where death had claimed its territory long ago. The walls, slick with moisture and centuries of grime, loomed over them, lined with the skeletal remains of thousands, perhaps millions, of souls who had long been erased from the annals of history. Each bone, each skull, was a silent witness to the darkness that had consumed Paris, a city built upon layers of life, death, and secrets buried too deep to be remembered. The catacombs had always felt like a world unto themselves, separate from the bustling city above, and now as Vasseur and Celeste raced deeper into the labyrinth of tunnels, they could feel the weight of that isolation pressing in on them. It was as though the catacombs themselves were alive, pulsating with a sinister energy, warning the two fugitives that there was no safe place here. No escape. No sanctuary. They were trespassing in the underworld. Vasseur's breath came in sharp, ragged gasps, each inhalation a struggle against the claustrophobic air, but it was the burning of his legs that gnawed at him most. His muscles screamed in protest as they carried him deeper, faster, through the winding corridors. His mind raced, calculating each turn, each choice in their escape route, but all he could focus on, all that mattered, was the vault. The encrypted research files that Moreau had hidden there were their only hope. The only key to understanding the larger conspiracy that had thrown them into this nightmare. If they didn't get those files, everything would be lost. Behind them, the echo of their pursuers' footsteps grew louder with every passing second, bouncing off the stone walls in a terrifying rhythm, growing closer. The assassins had been on their tail since their daring escape from the hidden lab in the depths of Paris, and though Vasseur didn't know how their enemies had discovered the existence of Moreau's research, he knew one thing for certain: whoever controlled those files controlled the future. The stakes had never been higher. They were no longer just pawns in a game, they were now fighting to stay alive in a battle for the very soul of mankind. Celeste, always calm under pressure, was by his side, her movements fluid and graceful despite the growing fatigue. She was a brilliant MI6 agent, resourceful, quick-thinking, and ever watchful. She knew how to stay one step ahead, and that was what kept them alive in moments like this. Her eyes flicked over her shoulder every few seconds, ensuring that the shadows didn't give way to enemies they couldn't see. They had been through hell together already, but the horror of their current situation was something neither had ever imagined, nor could they have prepared for. Despite the terror that gripped him, Vasseur knew that if there was anyone he trusted to make it through this alive, it was Celeste. "We need to keep going," she said, her voice strained but firm, the words coming out between ragged breaths. There was determination there, but it was mixed with exhaustion. Both of them were pushing the limits of what their bodies could endure. "We're almost there." Vasseur didn't respond, but he nodded. His legs burned, his chest ached with every breath, but he had no choice. They couldn't stop, not now. If they did, they were as good as dead. The catacombs were a maze, and their pursuers knew them better than anyone. The assassins chasing them weren't just skilled killers, they were shadows who moved through the labyrinth with a terrifying familiarity. They knew every hidden alcove, every secret passage. They knew how to corner their prey, how to strike when least expected. And Vasseur had no illusions about what would happen if they were caught. These weren't just rogue agents or mercenaries, they were members of a shadowy network with resources that spanned the globe, a global network so vast and powerful that even the CIA would seem small in comparison. They would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. And they wanted Moreau's research. The tunnels twisted and turned, narrowing in some places, then widening into vast, echoing chambers where the only sound was the distant drip of water, the scurrying of rats, and the beat of their footsteps against the stone floor. Each turn they took was a decision, a choice between survival and being trapped forever in the dark. Vasseur's mind was racing, calculating every possibility. Every potential escape route, every option for evading their pursuers. But even as he made these calculations, his body was telling him that time was running out. The sound of the footsteps behind them was growing louder, the assassins getting closer. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from behind them. Vasseur's heart skipped a beat, and his muscles tensed as though they were already in the grip of fear. The unmistakable sound of boots striking stone was growing nearer, the rhythm quickening. The assassins were closing in on them. They had no time. The tunnel in front of them seemed endless, stretching out into darkness, but it was also narrowing, and there was no sign of an exit. "We need to find cover," Vasseur whispered urgently to Celeste, his voice strained, his mind already working on the next move. Without hesitation, Celeste grabbed his arm, pulling him down a narrow side passage that seemed to disappear into the dark abyss. The walls here were slick with grime, the stones slick with moisture. The flickering light of their torches barely cut through the inky blackness. Vasseur knew it wouldn't be enough to shake their pursuers for long. The assassins were trained to track and corner their prey. They would catch up to them sooner rather than later. As they rounded another sharp corner, Vasseur's hand instinctively reached for the hidden compartment in his jacket. His fingers trembled as they brushed against the cool metal of the device Moreau had entrusted to him, the encrypted research files. They were more than just data. They were the key to unlocking a web of secrets that could change the course of history. The weight of the files in his hand felt as though he was holding the fate of the world itself. He didn't dare stop to look at them, but there was a moment, a brief flicker of realization that struck him with force. They couldn't fail now. If they did, Moreau's death and the deaths of so many others would be in vain. They had to keep pushing forward. They had no choice. The tunnel ahead stretched endlessly, its black maw beckoning them further into the labyrinth. The torches cast long shadows on the stone walls, stretching and distorting like specters of the past. Each step they took was a step further away from safety and closer to the unknown dangers that awaited them. The catacombs were a crypt, a mausoleum, but it was also a prison, a cage they couldn't escape from. Not without the files. Not without the truth. And then, without warning, a figure stepped out of the shadows, blocking their path. He moved with deadly precision, his footsteps barely making a sound on the stone floor. Dressed in black from head to toe, he was a shadow among shadows, a specter of death. His eyes locked onto Vasseur's with cold, calculating intent. He was a professional. His movements, his demeanor, his presence, all of it screamed danger. This wasn't just an assassin. This was a hunter. Before either of them could react, the assassin lunged. Instinct took over. Vasseur twisted to the side, his body moving with a speed that belied his exhaustion. He felt the blade whiz by his throat, grazing the side of his neck. A sharp pain shot through his body, a reminder that death was always just a breath away. His heart hammered in his chest as adrenaline flooded his system, sharpening his senses. But Celeste didn't hesitate. She was already moving, her gun drawn in one smooth motion. The silenced shot rang out, echoing through the catacombs. The assassin dropped to the ground, a crimson stain spreading beneath him, his body falling silent. Vasseur took a deep breath, trying to steady his pulse. That was too close. Celeste didn't waste a word. Her eyes were already scanning the area, her mind calculating their next move. We don't have much time. They're still coming. Vasseur knew she was right. They couldn't waste another second. Every passing moment brought the assassins closer to them. They had no time to lose. With a grim nod, he pulled Celeste forward, urging her to move faster. They plunged deeper into the labyrinth, the distant sounds of pursuit growing louder with every step, every twist and turn. They fought through each obstacle, but the cost of each encounter was starting to show. Their bodies ached, their minds grew weary, but there was no room for rest. The stakes were too high. And then, after what felt like an eternity of running and fighting, they reached the alcove. The vault was small, inconspicuous, but it was hidden deep within the heart of the catacombs. Vasseur had no idea how Moreau had managed to find it, but he didn't care. It was their only hope. His hands trembled as he unlocked the vault. Inside he found a small, nondescript briefcase, the key to their survival. He lifted the case with a deep breath, feeling the weight of the world in his hands. The encrypted research files were inside. The files that could change everything. "We have to go," Celeste whispered urgently. Her eyes darted around, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Vasseur nodded, clutching the case tightly as if it were the last lifeline in an ocean of chaos. The vault closed with a soft thud, and they turned to leave. But as they made their way back through the tunnels, they heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Too many footsteps. They were trapped. Vasseur cursed under his breath. The catacombs had become their cage, and the assassins were closing in. Their only chance now was to fight their way out. "We fight our way out," he said firmly, his voice unyielding. Celeste didn't hesitate. Agreed. And so, they prepared for the final fight for survival. Chapter 9: The Sacré-Cœur Cipher. Night had descended upon Paris, enveloping the city in a blanket of darkness, save for the soft flickering lights of the city's streets. The flickers, like stars on earth, seemed distant and unreachable, and in the stillness of the night there was an undeniable sense of foreboding. Vasseur and Celeste stood in the shadow of the Sacré-Cœur Basilica, its towering white dome standing stark against the darkened sky, like a watchful sentinel over the city of light. It had been a long journey to get here, a journey that had taken them from the suffocating tunnels of the Paris catacombs to the heart of Montmartre. Each step they had taken had been filled with danger, and now at last they stood before one of Paris's most iconic landmarks, battered, exhausted, and on the edge of desperation. The escape from the catacombs had drained them both, every second there feeling like an eternity. Their hearts had raced, adrenaline had surged, and yet they had made it out alive, barely. But now, in the quiet of the Parisian night, they were no longer concerned with the physical toll. The stakes had escalated to something more than just survival. A cryptic clue had led them to this very spot, and with it, the fate of their mission hung in the balance. Vasseur gripped the leather-bound manuscript tightly, the weight of it heavy in his hands. The Baudelaire manuscript. It had been a constant companion during their flight, its pages worn at the edges from hours of study. Each turn of the page seemed to reveal a little more, yet the meaning of the text remained as elusive as ever. The manuscript, once thought to be a mere collection of Baudelaire's poetry, now seemed to be more than that. It was a code. A code that led them here, to the steps of the Sacré-Cœur, a place where history and mystery intertwined, as though hidden in plain sight. Vasseur's eyes moved over the pages once more, his mind racing to make sense of it. The words within these pages were the key, he was certain of it. But unlocking their true meaning required more than just reading the text. It demanded an understanding of the hidden layers beneath. And at the heart of it all was Moreau's encrypted research. It was the key to everything, an extraordinary discovery that had the potential to change the world. If they could unlock the research, they could stop the global powers that sought to control it, powers that would stop at nothing to claim it for themselves. But first, they had to survive long enough to uncover it. "There's something about this manuscript," Vasseur muttered under his breath, his voice tinged with frustration. He paused, lifting his eyes from the book for a moment. His gaze swept across the shadowed landscape of Montmartre, his mind shifting gears. Baudelaire was known for his symbolism, his dark poetry, but I don't think this is just about literature. I think it's more than that. It's a code, hidden in plain sight. Celeste, ever the perceptive one, stepped closer. Her sharp eyes flicked over the manuscript in Vasseur's hands, her brow furrowing as she absorbed the text. She was a master of puzzles, codes, and hidden meanings, able to decipher things that others would miss entirely. Her mind was a brilliant weapon, and at this moment Vasseur knew he could trust her to find the answer. "Let's break it down," Celeste said, her voice calm and steady. Baudelaire's poetry often referenced places, people, and symbols connected to Paris's darker side, its underworld. What if this clue isn't about what's written in the manuscript itself, but rather where the clue is hidden? Vasseur's heart skipped a beat. He looked at her, his eyes wide with realization. "You think it's connected to Sacré-Cœur?" Celeste's gaze remained fixed on the manuscript, and a quiet confidence radiated from her. It could be. Baudelaire had a deep fascination with the darker elements of Paris, the places where the light and shadows meet, the hidden parts of the city that most people never see. And Sacré-Cœur, this place, is one of those contradictions. It's the highest point in Paris, a place of spiritual significance. But it's also a place where the sacred and the profane come together. If we're looking for a cipher, a symbol, or a clue, this could very well be it. The wind began to stir, rustling through the trees that lined the plaza before Sacré-Cœur. From below, the distant hum of Parisian traffic echoed through the night, a subtle reminder that life in the city continued. But up here, atop Montmartre, the world felt quieter, more isolated. The church stood like an implacable guardian of the city, its grandeur dwarfing the streets below. It was a place of reverence, yet there was something unsettling about its isolation, its towering presence that made the world seem distant and unreachable. The air was thick with history, with the weight of centuries of pilgrims and seekers who had come before them. The two of them crossed the plaza and entered the basilica. The massive wooden doors creaked as they pushed them open, and the cool, reverent air of the interior wrapped around them like a shroud. The atmosphere within was markedly different from the vibrant streets outside, quiet, still, sacred. It was the kind of place that inspired awe, a place where whispers and prayers mingled in the heavy air. Flickering candlelight danced in the corners of the cathedral, casting fleeting shadows that seemed to shift with the passing moments. Vasseur's gaze was drawn upward, to the grand mosaic that dominated the dome above. The image of Christ in glory, his arms stretched out in eternal welcome, seemed to almost come alive in the dim light. The mosaic was a radiant burst of color, depicting a figure of divine triumph. Yet for all its magnificence, it held no answers to the questions that haunted Vasseur's mind. He was not here for divine inspiration. He was here for something far more elusive, a key to unlock the encrypted research that held the power to change everything. Celeste, always practical and focused, broke the silence with a soft whisper. "We need to focus. There's something here, I can feel it." Vasseur nodded, his attention snapping back to the task at hand. The manuscript had led them here, to this very place. And in this cathedral, hidden among its soaring arches, its sacred relics and its history, lay the final pieces of the puzzle. They had no choice but to find it. The clock was ticking, and their enemies were drawing closer. As they walked through the grand hall, the sacred surroundings seemed almost at odds with their purpose. The high arches loomed above them, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the silence of the basilica. Everything felt distant, detached, as though the church itself existed outside of time and space. There was a deep stillness here, but beneath it a sense of urgency. They had no time to waste. Vasseur's eyes darted over the vast interior, his mind racing to decipher the clue that had brought them here. Celeste, always the sharp-eyed observer, moved toward one of the smaller altars along the side of the basilica. It was a modest affair compared to the grandeur of the main altar, but there was something about it that seemed out of place. Something that didn't belong. Something new. "Do you see that?" Celeste's voice was low, almost breathless. Her fingers traced the edges of a small stone tablet that rested on the altar. It wasn't large, and it didn't immediately catch the eye, but there was something about it, something subtle, that made Celeste's instincts flare. It seemed new, as though it had been placed there recently. Or maybe it had been hidden for years, waiting to be discovered. Vasseur approached cautiously, drawn to her excitement. "What is it?" "I'm not sure yet," Celeste replied, her voice thick with anticipation. "But it doesn't belong here. It's too new. Like it's been hidden in plain sight." Her fingers brushed away the dust that had accumulated over the years, revealing the stone's surface more clearly. Then with a soft click, a hidden compartment opened within the altar, and out slid a small metallic box. Vasseur's pulse quickened. This was it. This was the moment they had been searching for. Celeste's eyes widened as she opened the box, her hands trembling with excitement. Inside, wrapped in delicate parchment, was an ancient document, fragments of a larger text. She unfurled it carefully, revealing the faintly etched letters on the yellowed paper. These were the missing pieces of the password they had been searching for, the final link in the chain that would unlock Moreau's discovery. Vasseur's voice was a low murmur, filled with awe. "Moreau must have hidden it here, this is it." His heart raced in his chest as he stepped closer, staring at the fragment in Celeste's hands. "But it's only part of the puzzle. We still need the rest." Celeste nodded, her gaze unwavering. She tucked the fragment securely into her jacket. "This place holds more secrets than we could ever imagine. But for now, we have what we came for." Just then, the distant sound of footsteps reached their ears. The unmistakable sound of approaching danger. They were not alone. "Not again," Celeste muttered, her fingers instinctively reaching for her gun. "We need to move. Now." Vasseur didn't need to be told twice. He knew that every second counted. Their enemies were closing in, and they had no choice but to escape. They darted toward the exit, their steps hurried but measured. The cathedral's secrets would have to wait. For now, survival was their only priority. As they made their way into the night, their hearts racing, Vasseur knew one thing for certain: they had the missing piece of the puzzle. The rest of the journey was just as perilous, but now, with this fragment of the password in their hands, the hope of unlocking Moreau's discovery was within reach. Chapter 10: The Assassin's Confession. The sterile white walls of the interrogation room felt cold and unforgiving, reflecting the tension that crackled in the air. Vasseur paced back and forth, his mind whirling with frustration, the weight of their situation pressing down on him like a heavy fog. The assassin, Jean-Luc Roussel, had been captured alive during their narrow escape from Sacré-Cœur, but so far he remained an enigma. He refused to speak, and that silence gnawed at Vasseur, maddening him with its persistence. Every time he tried to break through, to extract some kind of response, Roussel remained unmoved, his face betraying no emotion, his eyes cold and impenetrable. It was as if the secrets he held were locked behind an impenetrable wall of discipline and resolve. It was maddening. Vasseur couldn't help but wonder if Roussel had been trained to withstand interrogation, to keep his silence at all costs. If so, they were facing a man who would not crack easily, no matter the pressure. Celeste sat at the table, her posture composed and professional, her sharp gaze fixed on the one-way mirror that separated the interrogation room from the observation area. The silence between them was thick, filled with unspoken tension. Both of them knew that this moment was their best chance to get the information they so desperately needed. Roussel's capture had been a turning point, but now that they had him, the question was, would he talk? Would they be able to extract the answers that would unravel the web of chaos that had been spiraling out of control? Time was running out. They couldn't afford to let Roussel slip through their fingers. They needed to know who was behind the assassination attempts, who was pulling the strings in this deadly game. The name Chancellor, whispered by Roussel in his final moments, still lingered in Vasseur's mind, an eerie riddle that seemed to mock them. It was a name they had yet to understand, a clue they had yet to decipher, and it felt like it was the key to everything. "Do you think he'll talk?" Celeste's voice cut through the silence, her tone calm, almost clinical, yet there was an undercurrent of frustration in her words. Her eyes didn't shift from the mirror as she spoke. Vasseur stopped pacing for a moment, his jaw tightening. He shook his head slowly, his frustration palpable. "I don't know. But I don't think he will. He's trained to resist. He's not some low-level operative. He's a professional. A master at what he does. He's not going to break under pressure." His voice was tinged with resignation as he turned to face her. "I've tried everything. I've pushed, cajoled, threatened, nothing works. He's locked tight. Whatever he knows, he's keeping it buried deep inside him." Celeste's eyes narrowed, her brow furrowing in concentration. "Then we'll need to break him the hard way." Her voice was resolute, her words a clear indication that she was not about to give up. She was prepared to do whatever it took, even if it meant going beyond the traditional methods of interrogation. Vasseur's expression darkened as he paced again, the weight of their predicament sinking in. "I've already used every method I know. Every trick in the book. And yet he's still holding out. He's not afraid of threats, and he's not intimidated by our tactics." He turned toward Celeste. "I think he's just playing a game with us. He's trying to outlast us." Celeste stood up from her seat, her movements deliberate and precise, her eyes never leaving Roussel, who sat silently across the room like a stone statue. "He may think he can outlast us, but he's wrong," she said coldly, her voice hardening. "He won't last. No one ever does." The door to the interrogation room creaked open, and a guard stepped in, his face grim, his body stiff with the same tension that permeated the room. His eyes met Vasseur's, and he didn't need to speak for the man to know something was wrong. "Sir," the guard said, his voice heavy with unease. "Roussel, he's dead." Vasseur's heart seemed to stop for a moment. He froze, his mind unable to process the words. "What do you mean, dead?" His voice barely rose above a whisper, disbelief coloring his tone. "Suicide, sir," the guard replied. "He used the wire from his uniform." Strung it up in his cell. We found him an hour ago. The words hit Vasseur like a blow to the chest. For a moment the room spun around him, and his breath caught in his throat. He had been so close. They had been on the verge of breaking through, of unraveling the mystery, and now it was all gone. Roussel had chosen death over speaking. It was as if he had known exactly what would happen if he opened his mouth, what consequences would follow. His silence, the walls he had built between them, had sealed his fate. They had been too late. Celeste's voice broke through the fog of Vasseur's thoughts. How could this happen? Her words were low, tinged with frustration and disbelief, her face a mask of anger and sorrow. She turned to Vasseur, her gaze intense. This was no ordinary man. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew we would be back for him. Vasseur nodded grimly, feeling a deep sense of loss in his chest. We were too late, he muttered. He knew what was coming. He knew that we wouldn't let him stay quiet forever, so he decided to end it before we could get to him. The guard stepped back, his presence reminding them that the investigation must continue. The scene in front of them was unsettling, but Vasseur couldn't afford to dwell on the loss. There was still work to be done. We'll need to report this, Vasseur said, his voice carrying a note of finality. We can't let this go unnoticed. As Vasseur turned toward the door, his thoughts spun, pulling him in a dozen different directions. What now? What were the next steps? The name Chancellor hovered in his mind, a shadow that refused to fade. Was it a title? A code name? Or was it the name of a person, someone powerful enough to orchestrate the assassination attempts, someone whose influence was vast and dangerous? And why had Roussel mentioned it in his final moments? Was it a clue? Or a warning? I'm going to see him, Vasseur said, his voice distant and cold, as though he had already made up his mind. His resolve was hardening, his purpose becoming clearer. Roussel may be gone, but whatever he left behind, whatever he knew, we'll find it. Celeste nodded, understanding the weight of his decision. She didn't need to ask any questions. They couldn't afford to waste any more time. The answers, though elusive, were out there. And they would find them, no matter the cost. They made their way to the small, dimly lit cell, where Roussel had taken his own life. It felt like a tomb. The air was thick and heavy with the staleness of death, a suffocating reminder of the assassin's final act. His lifeless body hung in the shadows, the sight of it a grim testament to how far he had been willing to go to protect the secrets he carried with him to the grave. But even in the silence of death, Vasseur's sharp eyes were scanning every inch of the cell, every corner, every surface, searching for something that might shed light on the mystery of the Chancellor. There had to be something. There had to be a clue, a hidden message, a trace left behind. Vasseur moved toward the desk where Roussel had kept his belongings. He found only a small, unmarked envelope that had been placed carefully on the surface. The envelope wasn't much, nothing special about it at all, but something about it caught Vasseur's attention. It was the way it had been positioned, as if deliberately placed for someone to find. His fingers trembled as he opened it, his heart racing in anticipation. Inside, there was a single piece of paper. The handwriting was hastily scrawled, barely legible, but the words were clear enough for Vasseur to read. The Chancellor watches everything. The words hit Vasseur like a punch to the gut. It was the same cryptic message Roussel had spoken moments before his death. It meant something. It had to. But what? Who was the Chancellor? What did this mean for them, for the investigation, for the future? The message was chilling, a warning from beyond the grave. Roussel had known something that would change everything, but he had taken it to his grave. And now, they were left to decipher what he had left behind. Vasseur turned the paper over, hoping for more, anything that might provide more context, more clues. But there was nothing. Just that single line. A riddle. A puzzle. What are you thinking? Celeste's voice broke through the silence behind him. She had been watching him, waiting for him to make sense of the cryptic message. Vasseur turned to face her, holding up the paper for her to see. This is all we have. The Chancellor, he said, his voice low and tense. Whoever or whatever this is, they're watching us. They know everything. This isn't just about Moreau's research. It's something bigger. Something far more dangerous. Celeste's brow furrowed as she looked at the paper, her mind racing with the possibilities. The Chancellor? It's not a name, is it? She asked, her voice quiet but sure. It's a title. Vasseur nodded slowly, his mind working furiously. Could be. Or maybe it's a group. A shadowy organization, pulling the strings from behind the scenes. Whoever or whatever they are, they've been watching us from the start. And they've been orchestrating everything. A shiver ran down Vasseur's spine as the weight of their situation settled in. This wasn't just a conspiracy, it was something much deeper, much darker. They had been playing a game, but now they were in the middle of a battle much bigger than they had ever imagined. The stakes were higher, the danger far more immediate. This changes everything, Celeste said quietly, her voice steady but filled with a newfound resolve. We need to find out who this Chancellor is, and fast. Vasseur turned back to the lifeless body of Roussel, his thoughts heavy with the implications of their discovery. The assassin's cold eyes seemed to stare back at him, a stark reminder of how high the stakes had become. The game had just gotten more deadly. There was no going back now. Whoever the Chancellor was, they needed to find them. Before it was too late. Before the shadow they had cast consumed them all. And with that thought, Vasseur's resolve hardened. Whatever it took, whoever the Chancellor was, they would find them. No one, nothing would stand in their way. Chapter 11. The Hunt for the Password. The streets of Paris pulsed with the life of the city. Beneath the shroud of twilight, the hum of distant cars, the chatter of pedestrians, and the rattle of the metro had all merged into the soundtrack of a world too alive, too busy, to acknowledge the invisible forces at play. But for Vasseur and Celeste, the city felt distant. The streets seemed like a mere backdrop to something much more profound, a slow-moving river of time through which they were being dragged, yet always on the edge as though standing on a precipice. The city's heartbeat was muffled, drowned by the tension between them, and the invisible threat that seemed to hover just out of reach. They stood at the entrance of the Paris Observatory, a gargantuan structure whose ancient stones seemed to absorb the weight of time itself. The building towered above them, standing proudly, untouched by the rapid advancements of the modern world around it. It was an imposing monument to the past, its Gothic architecture speaking of the glories of a forgotten age. Ornate ironwork and stone carvings covered its exterior, and the observatory's great dome stretched high into the night sky. Despite the clarity of the stars above, it was as though the entire building was a keeper of secrets, cloaking the knowledge within its depths, hidden beneath layers of forgotten history. In the stillness of the evening, the observatory seemed almost too quiet, as if time itself had slowed down. The usual bustle of researchers, astronomers, and engineers who had once roamed these halls, studying the stars and the vast unknown, had long since evaporated. Now all that remained was the faintest whisper of the wind as it passed through the cracks in the walls, carrying with it the heavy scent of ancient wood and dust. The light from the observatory's dome illuminated the surrounding area, but even that felt eerily subdued, as if the light itself had lost some of its strength, dimmed by the weight of whatever lay hidden inside. Vasseur's eyes darted to the towering structure. He could feel his heartbeat quicken, but not from excitement. There was something deeply unsettling about this place, something that spoke to him on an instinctual level. And yet they had come too far to turn back now. He couldn't afford to question anything, not when they were so close to the truth. Beside him, Celeste remained still, her posture tense but purposeful. Her gaze never wavered, scanning the area with the quiet confidence of someone who had been trained to read the world around her. Her body language was always the first clue to the atmosphere they were in. In this moment she was already alert, always 2 steps ahead, her senses heightened to the slightest threat even before it appeared. Vasseur admired her ability to read situations and people, to understand when to act, when to retreat, and when to hold her ground. "We can't afford to be slow here," Celeste's voice was a sharp whisper, cutting through the silence like a blade. She was always a few steps ahead, her mind racing with possibilities, calculations, and plans of action, each one designed to survive what they were up against. Vasseur felt the tension in his chest tighten as he nodded. I know. The Chancellor's forces are closing in, and we can't waste another second. But Orpheus said we need to find the password here, in the observatory. If he's right, this will give us the last piece we need. Her eyes were dark with a mixture of doubt and suspicion, and Vasseur caught the slight flicker of it. I don't trust Orpheus, she said, the words coded in a hardness he hadn't expected. I'm still not sure whose side he's really on. But if the password's here, we'll find it. Vasseur's own reservations about Orpheus were just as deep, but they had little choice now. The enigmatic figure had guided them through perilous waters so far, and he had promised them that the answers they sought were here, within the confines of the Paris Observatory. Orpheus had been a shadowy presence, always one step ahead, always offering cryptic messages that seemed both too insightful and too dangerous to ignore. And despite his doubts, Vasseur had no other leads, no other source of information. If they were to survive, they had to follow the trail, wherever it might lead. Their footsteps echoed in the silence as they moved forward, entering the observatory's grand entrance. The hall they stepped into was vast and dimly lit, a place that seemed both ancient and modern at once. The polished brass and dark wood furnishings that lined the hallways were worn with age, yet still imposing. The very air seemed to carry the weight of knowledge, of history, and of discovery. The scent of old books and metal combined to create an almost intoxicating atmosphere. It was a place that had once seen the birth of scientific revolution, where astronomers and mathematicians had peered into the void of space, looking for answers to questions that still haunted mankind. And now that same space had become a labyrinth of secrets, locked doors, and dangerous knowledge. Vasseur led the way, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and fear. Every step he took seemed to bring them closer to the heart of the observatory, closer to the quantum supercomputer Hyperion, which lay hidden in the bowels of the building. The password they were hunting, a string of 47 characters, was the key to unlocking the greatest discovery of the century. But it was also the key to something far darker: control. Whoever controlled Hyperion controlled the future. It's almost too quiet, Vasseur murmured, his voice tight with unease. He glanced behind him, half expecting to see someone or something waiting just behind them. There was a creeping sensation that they were not alone, that the very walls of the observatory were watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. Celeste didn't respond immediately, but her hand drifted toward the hidden gun tucked under her jacket. Her eyes, ever sharp, remained focused on every shadow, every fleeting movement. Her instincts were warning her, just as they always had. Vasseur could feel the tension in her shoulders, the low hum of alertness that radiated from her like a shield. He trusted her, but he knew that no amount of preparation could stop the unknown. When they reached the grand wooden doors that separated the main hall from the observatory's heart, Vasseur held up a hand. He paused, his mind working quickly, trying to piece together the puzzle. The password was so close now, so tantalizingly close. But the closer they got to it, the more dangerous it became. The Chancellor's forces were hunting them, and this was the final piece of the puzzle. If they didn't succeed, everything would fall apart. They would lose everything. We need to be ready for anything, Vasseur said, his voice low and urgent. Orpheus said Hyperion is buried deep within the systems, hidden from prying eyes. But if Roussel's people are here... Celeste's expression darkened and her gaze hardened. We'll be ready. With a final nod, Vasseur pushed open the doors to the control room. The vastness of the space hit him immediately. This was no mere observatory. This was a cathedral of technology, a place where the boundaries of human knowledge had been stretched to their breaking point. The walls were lined with rows of servers, computer terminals flickering softly in the dim light, and at the center of it all was Hyperion, a quantum supercomputer unlike anything Vasseur had ever seen before. Hyperion was a sleek, metallic beast, its smooth, polished surface reflecting the ambient light above. It hummed with quiet power, its systems almost alive with the weight of potential. This machine had the capacity to reshape the future, to unlock the secrets of Moreau's work, and it was the key to the final fragment of the password. Vasseur's heart raced as he stepped closer to it, feeling the intense, almost electric pull of its presence. This was it. This was the moment they had been fighting for. "What now?" Celeste asked, her voice low and steady, betraying none of the fear that clung to the edges of Vasseur's mind. Vasseur's gaze never left Hyperion. "Orpheus said that Hyperion would recognize the fragment we already have. When we enter it, it will trigger the rest of the password. But the system is locked behind multiple layers of encryption. We have to input the first part, and then we should have access to everything." Celeste moved to one of the terminals with practiced ease. Her fingers danced over the keyboard, entering commands faster than Vasseur could follow. Every keystroke was a calculated risk, each one bringing them closer to their goal, or to disaster. After what felt like an eternity, Celeste leaned back slightly and muttered, "I'm in. I've connected the first fragment to Hyperion. Now we wait." Vasseur's eyes never left the screen as the encryption protocols slowly processed the input. Each moment felt agonizingly long, but they couldn't stop now. They were so close. The room seemed to vibrate with the hum of the supercomputer, and for a brief moment, Vasseur allowed himself to hope. Then the screen flickered. The sound of the supercomputer's hum intensified, the mechanical whirring growing louder as the system came to life. Data began to flood the screens, streams of code filling the monitors as though the machine itself had awoken from a long slumber. Vasseur held his breath, waiting for the next step. But before they could move forward, the faintest sound reached his ears, something soft but unmistakable. A footstep, quiet but deliberate, echoing from the hallway beyond. Celeste's hand went to her weapon, her body going rigid. "We're not alone," she whispered. Vasseur's heart skipped a beat. They found us. The clock was ticking, and the final password was nearly within their reach. But the assassins were closing in, and they had no idea how much time they had left. Chapter 12: The Chase on the Seine. The night had settled over Paris like a velvet shroud, the city alive with the hum of activity, but drenched in an eerie, almost oppressive quiet. The low glow of streetlights reflected off the waters of the Seine, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly into the night. It was as if the very river itself had become a thread of silver, winding its way through the heart of the city, guiding those who dared to follow it. But tonight, the river did not speak of calm or serenity. Tonight it whispered of danger, of pursuit, of a frantic chase that had turned the city into a labyrinth. Vasseur and Celeste, their minds racing with the weight of the task at hand, stood in the small, cramped cabin of their boat, eyes flicking nervously from the dark banks of the river to the night sky above. Their senses were on high alert, every sound amplified in the stillness, every shadow a potential threat. They were not alone on the river tonight. Behind them, the shadows were taking form, dark shapes that moved with purpose, with deadly intent. After cracking the final part of the password within the depths of Hyperion, they had uncovered the next crucial clue. It was a set of coordinates, seemingly innocuous, but leading them to a nondescript dock along the Seine. A hidden vault lay there, its secrets locked away, holding the last piece of Moreau's encrypted research. But the moment they had made their move, everything had gone wrong. The mercenaries, a hired force with a singular mission, had been waiting for them. And now Vasseur and Celeste were in the thick of a high-speed chase, racing across the water like hunted animals fleeing their predators. Vasseur's knuckles were white as they gripped the steering wheel, the vibrations from the powerful engine beneath his hands sending a thrill of adrenaline up his spine. He could feel the pulse of the city in his veins, but that energy was not one of excitement, it was the cold rush of fear. The mercenaries had anticipated their escape route, and they were already on the water, closing in fast. Vasseur's heart beat loudly in his chest as he glanced at Celeste, her face tense, her eyes scanning the darkness. She was always a few steps ahead, the strategist, the one who saw danger before it arrived. "Are you ready?" Vasseur asked, his voice tight. Celeste nodded, her hand brushing the side of her jacket where her weapon was hidden. She was calm, but there was a sharpness to her movements, a quickness in her breath that told Vasseur she wasn't fooled by the calm of the moment. "We need to shake them off," she said, her voice steady but with a flicker of urgency. The night was torn apart by the sharp crack of gunfire, blasts that echoed across the water, slamming into the surface just behind them. The mercenaries were closing in, their sleek black boats cutting through the river with the precision of trained hunters. Vasseur's grip tightened on the wheel, his focus unwavering as he sped the boat forward. It was a battle of wills now, a race against not only the mercenaries but time itself. They weren't just running for their lives, they were racing to uncover the final clue, the key to unlocking the full extent of Moreau's research. Whoever controlled that knowledge could change the course of history. "Hold on," Vasseur shouted over the roar of the engine as he slammed the throttle forward, pushing the boat faster into the churning waters. The wind whipped through their hair, the cold air stinging their faces as the boat surged ahead. The skyline of Paris was a blur in their peripheral vision, the lights of the city smearing together as they tore through the dark water, their only focus the dock ahead, the final destination that could hold the answers they so desperately sought. Celeste crouched low in her seat, eyes constantly shifting between the riverbanks and the mercenary boats that were rapidly gaining on them. Her fingers brushed the handle of her sidearm, but she kept it holstered. A firefight wasn't their objective, not yet. They had to outmaneuver their pursuers, keep them off balance long enough to reach the dock. The fate of everything they had worked for hung in the balance. "2 boats behind us, both armed," she reported, her voice calm but with an edge of concern. "They've got heavy firepower. This isn't going to be easy." Vasseur nodded, his jaw clenched. He could hear the rapid succession of bullets cutting through the air behind them, the staccato bursts striking the water, sending up splashes that sprayed over the sides of the boat. The mercenaries were relentless, gaining ground with every passing second. They were getting closer, and there was no time to waste. With a hard twist of the wheel, Vasseur swerved the boat to the right, feeling the hull scrape the water as he executed the maneuver. The boat tilted precariously to the side, sending a wave crashing against the mercenary boats, destabilizing them for a moment. It was enough to give Vasseur a fleeting moment of hope, until the mercenaries adjusted, their boats gliding effortlessly through the water, their engines roaring in pursuit. They were still coming, faster now, more determined than ever. "Get ready," Celeste shouted, her eyes narrowing as she pointed ahead. "The bridge." Vasseur's eyes followed her gaze, locking onto the distant shape of an old stone bridge that spanned the river. It was narrow, the arch a relic of Paris's centuries-old history. The bridge was their only chance. If they could make it beneath the arch before their pursuers reached them, they might be able to lose them in the twisting waterways beyond. But the timing had to be perfect. If they misjudged the turn, they'd be trapped. "We're taking the bridge," Vasseur said, his voice strained. "Hold on." He jerked the steering wheel to the left, aiming for the narrow gap beneath the stone arch. The boat surged forward, its powerful engine cutting through the water as they neared the bridge. The gap was shrinking with every second, the arch ahead seeming to grow larger as they approached. "Don't miss it, Vasseur." Celeste's voice was filled with urgency, her eyes fixed on the bridge, measuring the distance with precision. The boat was cutting through the water like a blade, the hull skimming dangerously close to the stones. Vasseur's heart raced, every instinct in him screaming to slow down, to take a different route. But there was no time for hesitation. They had only one shot at this. The final clue was within reach, and they couldn't afford to waste it. With a sharp breath, Vasseur slammed the throttle forward, the boat surging forward at breakneck speed. The hull scraped beneath the stone bridge, barely clearing the edge of the structure. For a split second, everything felt suspended, like time itself had slowed. They were flying beneath the arch, the mercenaries forced to slow their boats as they approached the bridge, losing valuable momentum in the swirling waters. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. The mercenaries, unable to match Vasseur's boat's agility, were momentarily slowed by the bridge. Their boats, heavier and less nimble, struggled against the current. In that moment, Vasseur and Celeste had gained precious ground. The chase was far from over, but for the first time, they had a lead. Keep going, Celeste urged, her eyes scanning the distance. They had bought themselves a few precious seconds, but it wouldn't be long before their pursuers recovered and closed the gap. They had to keep moving. Vasseur didn't look back. His gaze remained fixed on the winding course ahead, his mind calculating every turn, every obstacle. He could see the silhouette of the small dock on the horizon, the place where they had to find the final clue. They were getting closer, but so were the mercenaries. Every moment that passed felt like a countdown, and there was no telling when their enemies would catch up. As the boat powered forward, Vasseur felt the weight of the mission pressing down on him. This chase wasn't just about survival, it was about securing the knowledge that could change everything. They had come so far and they couldn't stop now. The dock loomed closer, the only sign of life in the stretch of water ahead. It was their final destination. But even as they neared it, Vasseur knew the chase was far from over. The mercenaries would stop at nothing to capture them. But there was no turning back now. "Get ready," Vasseur said quietly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "We're almost there." Celeste nodded, her weapon ready. She kept her eyes trained on the rear view, scanning the water behind them, knowing full well that the battle was not yet won. The boat surged forward, the engine roaring, the chase intensifying with every passing second. They had almost made it. The answers they sought, the final piece of the puzzle, was just within reach. They would do whatever it took to claim it, no matter the cost. Chapter 13: The Royal Betrayal. The city of Paris had fallen into a quiet stillness, a peace that seemed unnatural after the madness of the past night. As the first light of dawn began to break through the clouds, the horizon shimmered with a cold gray glow, casting an almost ghostly hue over the cobblestone streets. The frenetic energy that had once fueled the chase, the gunfire, the heart-pounding escape from the mercenaries, these were now but echoes in the air, lost in the early morning fog that rolled over the city. Yet for Vasseur and Celeste, there was no sense of calm. No solace in the misty quiet. The world they were battling in, one twisted with lies, betrayals, and hidden agendas, had pulled them deeper into a labyrinth of secrets, and they were now further entangled than ever before. Their recent escape from the mercenaries had been nothing short of miraculous. The chase on the Seine had been relentless, an all-out sprint for survival, but they had managed to elude their pursuers, at least for the time being. The final clue had led them to a small, forgotten dock along the river's edge, where they uncovered a chest hidden among the debris. Inside they had found a relic, one that seemed to fit perfectly into the growing puzzle they had been piecing together. At first, the insignia they discovered seemed to be just another cryptic object to add to the list, a meaningless artifact in the midst of their search. But as they examined it more closely, under the soft glow of the lantern on their boat, a chilling realization swept over them. The insignia wasn't just any relic, it was the royal insignia of Prince Alexander, the heir to the French throne. The discovery sent a cold shiver down Vasseur's spine. Prince Alexander. His name had been tied to power and privilege within the French nobility for years. It wasn't just an insignia, it was a symbol of a man, a royal figure whose bloodline had long been a beacon of strength and influence in the corridors of French power. But the more they examined the relic, the more unsettling the discovery became. It wasn't just a relic of the prince's past, it was a signpost that pointed directly to the heart of a much darker conspiracy. Alexander had been more than just a figurehead in this game. He had been manipulated, used as a pawn by forces beyond his understanding. And the realization made Vasseur's stomach churn. As they stood outside a small café near the royal palace, the weight of their new understanding hung over them like an invisible storm cloud. The sun had barely risen, but Vasseur and Celeste's faces were hard with resolve. Their shared glance was one of mutual determination. The time for running was over. There was no more hiding. No more evading. They had uncovered the first pieces of the truth, but now they had to confront it head-on, no matter the consequences. And that truth, they had come to understand, led them directly to the very heart of the monarchy itself. Vasseur's voice broke the stillness of the morning air, barely audible, as he muttered a name that sent a wave of dread through his chest. Cardinal Renaud. His hand gripped the iron railing of the café terrace tightly, his knuckles white. His eyes remained fixed on the distant silhouette of the royal palace, its majestic spires just barely visible in the morning fog. He's the one who's been pulling the strings all along. Celeste stood beside him, her jaw clenched, her face a picture of quiet fury. I never trusted him, she said, her voice low but tinged with venom. Too ambitious. Too willing to do whatever it took to seize power. She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing, but I didn't expect this, using Alexander as a pawn in his game. Vasseur nodded, his face hardening. Neither did I. But now it all makes sense. The church, the royal family, he's had them all under his control. All these years, he's been using Alexander's trust, manipulating him into following his every word, believing that he's acting in the best interest of France. But the question remains, why? What does Renaud gain from all of this? Celeste crossed her arms over her chest, her gaze piercing as she thought it through. Maybe it's not about what he gains directly, she suggested, her voice firm. Maybe it's about control. Alexander is the heir to the throne. If Renaud can control the prince, he controls the future of France. Vasseur's brow furrowed in contemplation. But why bring Moreau into this? Why go to such lengths to hide his research and involve us in all of this? Moreau was never a part of the royal game. He was a scientist. A recluse, hiding from the world. What does he have to do with all of this power play? Celeste's eyes narrowed, as though searching for an answer herself. Maybe it wasn't just about power, she said slowly, as the pieces began to fit together. Maybe it was about something bigger, something that could change the entire balance of power, not just in France, but in Europe. We know Moreau was working on something monumental, something that could shift the very foundations of society. Cardinal Renaud could see that. If he controls what Moreau created, he controls the future of not just France, but the entire world. Vasseur's mind raced, but the puzzle was still incomplete. They had uncovered pieces, yes, but the full picture remained elusive. Moreau's work was clearly the key to everything, but what exactly had the scientist discovered? And why was it so important to the powers that be? And then there was the most troubling question of all. Who was really behind this all? They had seen Cardinal Renaud's hand at work, manipulating those around him, but someone else, someone with far greater influence, was pulling the strings from the shadows. Vasseur's voice was barely a whisper, as the realization hit him. The Chancellor, he murmured, the name coming out as a sudden and terrifying truth. It's always been the Chancellor. He's the one orchestrating this entire thing. Celeste's eyes widened in disbelief. You think the Chancellor is behind all of this? But we've seen him in other circles. He's involved in so many different matters. What could he possibly want with Moreau's discovery? Vasseur's teeth ground together in frustration. The Chancellor has been using Renaud, just like he's been using everyone else. He knew that Moreau's research, whatever it is, could change the world. He knew it could shift the balance of power. If the Chancellor controls it, he can shape the future in whatever image he desires. Moreau was on the brink of discovering something that could give its wielder unimaginable control. And the Chancellor has been manipulating the pieces all along, waiting for the right moment to strike. Celeste's expression hardened with the weight of the revelation. But why hasn't he made a move yet? Why hasn't he come after us directly? Vasseur's mind spun, but he paused to consider her question. I think he's been watching us. Testing us. He needed to be sure we were capable of uncovering the truth. He didn't want to make his move until he knew for certain that we would get to this point. Now that we've uncovered the final clue, he'll act. He's been patient, but we've forced his hand. Celeste's gaze hardened with determination. So it's not over, she said, her voice unwavering. It's just beginning. Vasseur nodded, the weight of their discoveries settling in. Exactly. But we're running out of time. The Chancellor's move is inevitable now. We can't let him get to Moreau's research first. Just as the two of them prepared to discuss their next steps, the sound of screeching tires interrupted the silence. A sleek black car pulled up to the entrance of the cafe, its engine purring as it came to a halt. The door opened, and a tall, elegant man stepped out. His sharp features and commanding presence were unmistakable. It was Prince Alexander. He paused for a moment, scanning the cafe with a cautious, guarded look. His eyes locked onto Vasseur and Celeste, a flicker of recognition passing over his face before his expression hardened into an impassive mask. "I know you two are trying to figure out what's going on," he said, his voice low and tinged with weariness. "But you're running out of time. My uncle Cardinal Renaud, he's not what you think. And neither am I." Vasseur narrowed his eyes, uncertainty flashing in his mind. "What do you mean?" Alexander's gaze hardened, his jaw set with resolve. "I've been used, manipulated, led down a path I didn't choose. But now I see the truth. Cardinal Renaud is no longer the only one who wants to control Moreau's work. There's someone else, someone I never suspected. And he's the one who's been controlling everything from behind the scenes. You were right, Vasseur. It's the Chancellor." Celeste stepped forward, her voice firm and unwavering. "Then help us. Help us stop him before he gets his hands on Moreau's discovery." Alexander hesitated for a moment, a flicker of indecision crossing his face, but then he nodded slowly. "I will. But we can't do it alone. We need to find the Chancellor before he finds us." Vasseur exchanged a glance with Celeste, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was a sliver of hope. The pieces were falling into place faster now. The royal betrayal had been just the beginning. The true battle, one for the future of France and perhaps the world, was only just beginning. And in the end, it wasn't just about power. It was about survival. Chapter 14: The Hidden Library. The winding streets of Montmartre, the heart of Paris's artistic history, held their old-world charm as Vasseur and Celeste made their way up the cobbled paths. The district, with its blend of culture and history, felt unchanged, as if the passage of time had no impact on its aura. Quaint cafes, with their wrought iron tables and chairs, lined the streets, and the distant hum of conversation created an ambient melody that seemed to accompany their every step. The intoxicating smell of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air, mixing with the fragrance of baked pastries. For a brief moment, Paris seemed timeless, its very essence woven into the fabric of the city. Yet there was no room for the romance of the surroundings, or the nostalgia that Montmartre's bohemian spirit evoked. Not tonight. Tonight, they had a singular goal in mind: to find the hidden library that would contain the final pieces of Moreau's research. And they were not here for inspiration or contemplation, but for something far darker, secrets that had been buried for years, secrets that had drawn them into this web of deception and danger. Moreau's private library wasn't a place of art, a sanctuary of peace or beauty, but a tomb of information, a crypt for the knowledge that could change the course of history. Vasseur's gaze swept over the narrow street as they approached an unassuming building nestled between a small antique shop and a gallery. Its facade, draped in ivy, seemed to have weathered the passage of centuries. The building was old, perhaps centuries old, its stone walls cracked from the erosion of time. At first glance, it appeared no different from any other old Parisian structure. To the untrained eye, it could have easily been overlooked, swallowed by the sea of similar buildings that lined the street. But Vasseur and Celeste were far from ordinary. They weren't just looking for a building, they were looking for the key to unlocking the truth. "This is it," Celeste murmured under her breath, her voice low as if the walls themselves might hear and betray them. Her eyes scanned the facade with a calculating look. Moreau's private library. This is where he kept his most precious research, the last pieces of the puzzle. Vasseur didn't speak at first. He simply nodded, his jaw tight with determination. If the final clue to unraveling the conspiracy was hidden here, they had to find it. And they had to find it before anyone else did. The clock was ticking, and the stakes were higher than ever. They had already come so far, and to fail now, to allow the Chancellor or the forces that had been shadowing them to claim victory, was not an option. With every step they took toward the building, the urgency in the air thickened, the gravity of the situation becoming more pronounced. Vasseur's hand rested lightly on his holstered weapon, his senses on high alert. In their line of work, trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. In fact, they had learned the hard way that the more they trusted, the more dangerous the world became. Everyone had an agenda. Even the people they thought were on their side could turn on them in an instant. The door to the building creaked as Vasseur unlocked it. The wood of the door was old, weathered by decades of exposure to the elements. As it opened, a musty scent wafted out, ancient paper, dust, and the unmistakable scent of a place that had been long forgotten. Vasseur and Celeste stepped inside, the dim light of their flashlights casting long shadows that danced eerily along the walls. The building was quiet, the only sound the soft echo of their footsteps on the wooden floor. They stood in what appeared to be an entryway, a space filled with shelves of books that stretched from floor to ceiling. The books were old, their spines cracked, many of them faded with age. There was a certain beauty to the place, a quiet elegance that spoke of generations of scholars and dreamers who had come before them. But beneath this veneer of history, the library was something more, something far darker. It was a place of secrets, of hidden knowledge that could not be left to fall into the wrong hands. "There's got to be more," Vasseur whispered, his voice barely audible. He wasn't just talking about the room in front of them. He was talking about the truth. There had to be more than what they had uncovered so far. He wasn't sure why, but something told him that the answers lay deeper within these walls, waiting to be discovered. Celeste moved quietly, her sharp eyes scanning the room as she ran her fingers along the spines of the books. She was testing for anything out of place, anything that might reveal a hidden compartment or passage. Her movements were fluid and purposeful, a practiced dance that revealed just how well she knew her craft. When she stopped in front of a shelf lined with old tomes of poetry, Vasseur watched her carefully, his attention split between her and the room around them. The books were bound in worn leather, their titles almost completely faded by time. Yet one stood out, as if calling to them. It was a thick volume, a dark green cover almost obscured by the grime of age. The gold lettering on its spine was barely visible, but there was no mistaking that it was different from the others. Celeste pulled it from the shelf, with an air of finality. "I think this is it," she said softly, her voice steady but tinged with excitement. She ran her fingers over the cover, sensing the odd weight of the book. It felt heavier than it should have, as though it contained more than just words, more than mere poetry. There was something hidden inside, something important. Vasseur's eyes narrowed as he watched her flip through the pages. The handwriting was beautiful, elegant, almost haunting in its delicacy. The poetry, written in flowing script, spoke of fleeting beauty, of love, loss, and longing. But Vasseur's mind wasn't on the beauty of the words. It was on something else, the markings in the margins. Small, almost imperceptible symbols, drawn in pencil, circled a particular passage on the second-to-last page. The markings were subtle, but they were unmistakable. Vasseur's heart skipped a beat as he realized the true nature of the book. This wasn't just a book of poetry, it was a map. A guide to something more valuable than they could have ever imagined. "Here," Celeste said, her finger tracing the highlighted passage. Her voice had dropped to a whisper, as if the room itself might be listening. The passage was cryptic, its meaning elusive at first glance. It spoke of journeys, physical and metaphorical, of hidden doors, of a light that could reveal what was concealed in darkness. It was a riddle, wrapped in metaphors, designed to confuse anyone who wasn't paying attention. Vasseur leaned closer, studying the words, but it wasn't just the poetry that caught his attention. It was the numbers. Hidden between the verses were a series of digits, arranged in what seemed like a random order. They weren't part of the poem itself, but they were clearly important. The numbers were not just an afterthought, they were the key. "It's a cipher," Vasseur murmured, his voice barely audible. His eyes traced the numbers with growing understanding. "A coded message." Celeste looked up, her gaze meeting his. "What do you think it means?" Vasseur didn't immediately answer. Instead, he leaned over her shoulder, his mind already processing the puzzle. This wasn't just about translating words. It was about cracking the code, deciphering the numbers, correlating them with the earlier clues they had gathered. This was the last piece of the puzzle. The final key to unlocking Moreau's research. "We need to figure this out," Vasseur said, his voice firm, his mind already spinning. The numbers danced in front of him, each one a step closer to the truth. Celeste, always the more methodical of the two, grabbed a notebook from her bag and began writing down the numbers. Her pen moved quickly, her thoughts racing as she worked through the calculations. The cipher was complex, but Celeste was no stranger to puzzles. She scribbled down theories, possible solutions, as Vasseur stepped back and began pacing the small space. Every piece of the puzzle had led them here. Every step had brought them closer to this moment. Now they just needed the final answer. As Celeste continued her work, Vasseur couldn't help but feel a rising sense of urgency. The final password was within reach. They had uncovered Moreau's secret, but the real challenge lay in unlocking it. Unlocking the knowledge that had been hidden for so long. They weren't just searching for information anymore. They were searching for power. And they weren't the only ones who knew it. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Vasseur stopped pacing. He turned to Celeste, his face alight with realization. "I think we've got it," he said. His voice was low, but there was an undeniable sense of triumph in his tone. Celeste paused, her pen stilling in her hand as she looked up at him. Slowly, a smile curled at the corners of her lips. "We've got the password." Vasseur nodded. The room seemed to hold its breath as they both gazed at the book in their hands. The final key to unlocking Moreau's research, the last piece of the puzzle, was in their grasp. But as the weight of that knowledge settled on their shoulders, they couldn't shake the feeling that their journey was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. "We need to go," Vasseur said, his voice firm. "We've got the final piece. But we don't have much time." Celeste nodded, her expression unreadable. "Let's get to work." They left the hidden library behind, the weight of Moreau's discovery heavy in their minds. The world they were about to enter was dangerous, filled with enemies who would stop at nothing to get their hands on what they now knew. But they weren't about to back down. The final password was only the beginning. They had just opened the door to a world of power, and it was a world they would have to fight to control.